It was 11:30 on a Tuesday morning when his family told me I wasn't welcome at the house after the funeral. We were standing in the parking lot of St. Michael's Church in Westchester County, New York, and his sister Linda said, "You weren't his wife. You have no claim to anything. You need to understand that." His daughter Amy was crying, but she nodded in agreement. His son Derek wouldn't even look at me, and his ex-wife Patricia stood there with her arms crossed like she'd won something. I'd just buried the man I'd loved for 8 years, and his family was treating me like I was some random stranger who'd wandered in off the street. What they didn't know was that 3 weeks before he died, Thomas had given me a birthday card with 6 numbers written inside, and a note that said, "When the time comes, you'll know what to do with these." I'd asked him what he meant. He'd just smiled and said, "Trust me." 20 minutes after his family told me to leave, the estate attorney mentioned a safe that nobody could open. And that's when I pulled out that birthday card and changed everything about who was getting what from Thomas Martin's estate. I'm Jessica Hayes. I'm 34 years old, and I'd been dating Thomas Martin for 8 years when he died of pancreatic cancer last month. Thomas was 57. We met at a charity fundraiser in Manhattan back in 2017. I was working in event planning, coordinating the whole evening. Thomas was there representing his investment firm, writing checks for causes he believed in. We'd started talking during the silent auction and ended up having drinks after the event was over. He'd told me he was divorced, that his kids were grown, that he was finally living life on his own terms. I'd liked how direct he was, how confident, how he looked at me like I was someone worth knowing, not just someone organizing his evening. Our relationship started slowly. Dinners on weekends, movies, long walks through Central Park. Thomas had money, but he wasn't flashy about it. He lived in a nice house in Scarsdale, but he drove a 10-year-old Volvo. He wore expensive suits to work, but jeans and sweaters on weekends. He was generous, but not showy. He donated to charities, but never wanted his name on buildings. He was exactly the kind of man I'd always hoped to find. Steady, kind, present. For 8 years, we built a life together. Not a traditional life. We didn't live together. He said he valued his space, and I valued mine. We'd see each other 4 or 5 times a week. We'd take vacations together. We'd talk every night before bed. It worked for us, but Thomas never proposed. Never even mentioned marriage. For the first few years, I'd wondered if it would happen. By year 5, I'd stopped wondering and just accepted that this was what we had. Some people need marriage, some people don't. Thomas fell into the second category, and I'd convinced myself I was fine with that. He'd been married once before, to Patricia, and that marriage had ended badly. 2 kids, Derek and Amy, who were now in their 30s. A messy divorce. Years of conflict over money and custody. Thomas had told me once that getting married again felt like volunteering to repeat the worst experience of his life. I'd said I understood, and I'd meant it, mostly. Thomas's family had never accepted me. His ex-wife Patricia hated me on principle. His daughter Amy was polite but cold. His son Derek ignored me completely. His sister Linda treated me like I was Thomas's midlife crisis that would eventually end. They'd all loved his first wife and had never forgiven him for the divorce, even though it had happened 15 years before I came along. To them, I was the reason Thomas never came back to Patricia. Never mind that Patricia had remarried. Never mind that Thomas had been single for 7 years before he met me. I was convenient to blame, so they blamed me. In June, Thomas was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. The doctors gave him 6 months. He'd lasted 4. Those 4 months were brutal. Watching someone you love fade away, knowing there's nothing you can do, is a special kind of torture. I'd been with him every day. Took him to appointments. Sat with him during chemo. Made him comfortable when the pain got too bad. His family had shown up occasionally. Derek came by once a week. Amy visited on weekends. Linda stopped by when it was convenient. Patricia had come once, stayed for 20 minutes, and left. I'd been the one there at 3 in the morning when he couldn't sleep. I'd been the one holding his hand when he was scared. I'd been the one who'd loved him enough to stay through the ugly parts. 3 weeks before he died, on my 34th birthday, Thomas had given me a card. Inside was a handwritten message that said, "Jessica, you've been the love of my life for 8 years. Thank you for every moment. When the time comes, you'll need these. Then 6 numbers. 9, 23, 0, 7, 14, 18. I'd asked him what they meant. He'd said, "You'll figure it out." I'd tucked the card into my wallet and tried not to think about what "when the time comes" meant. But I'd known. The time would come when he was gone. Thomas died on a Monday morning in October. I'd been there. So had Derek. Thomas had slipped away peacefully, if you can call death from cancer peaceful. Derek had called the rest of the family. Within an hour, the house was full of people. Patricia, Amy, Linda, cousins I'd never met, friends from his past, and me, sitting in the corner, feeling like an intruder in the death of the man I'd loved. Nobody had acknowledged me. Nobody had asked if I was okay. I'd left after an hour because I couldn't stand the way they looked through me like I didn't exist. The funeral was 6 days later. I'd sat in the back of the church. I'd cried through the entire service. I'd watched Patricia and the kids sit in the front row accepting condolences like they were the only people who'd loved him. I'd watched Linda give a eulogy that painted Thomas as a devoted family man. I'd bitten my tongue and said nothing because what was the point? These people had their version of Thomas. I had mine. They didn't need to intersect. After the service, in the parking lot, Linda had approached me. She'd said, "Jessica, we need to talk about the estate." I'd said, "Okay." She'd said, "You weren't married to Thomas. You're not family. You won't be getting anything from his estate. The house, his assets, everything goes to his children and to Patricia as part of their original divorce agreement." I'd said, "I didn't expect anything." Linda had said, "Good. Because some women in your position would try to make claims. We wanted to be clear that won't be happening." Derek had been standing next to her, nodding. Amy had been crying, but she'd said, "I'm sorry, but Mom and Linda are right. You weren't his wife." Patricia had said, "Thomas and I were married for 20 years. His real family comes first." I'd walked away. I'd gotten in my car. I'd driven back to my apartment in Brooklyn and cried for 3 hours. Not because I'd expected money. I hadn't, but because they'd been so cruel about it. So dismissive. Like 8 years of loving someone meant nothing because we hadn't signed a piece of paper. The next day, the estate attorney, a man named Richard Foster, had called everyone to his office in White Plains for the reading of the will. I'd been surprised to get the call. Richard had said Thomas had specifically requested I be present. I'd driven to White Plains and walked into a conference room where Patricia, Derek, Amy, and Linda were already seated. They'd all looked at me like I was crashing a private party. Richard had started reading the will. The house in Scarsdale went to Derek and Amy to split or sell as they chose. Thomas's investment accounts, worth about $2 million, were divided between his children. His car and personal belongings went to Derek. His art collection, which wasn't worth much, went to Amy. Linda got a few family heirlooms. Patricia got nothing because she'd already received her settlement in the divorce years ago. Then Richard had paused. He'd said, "There's one more item." Thomas had a safe in his home office. It's a floor safe, built into the concrete. The combination was never shared with anyone in the family. However, Thomas left specific instructions that if anyone present has the combination, they're to open it, and the contents belong to them. The family had looked at each other, confused. Derek had said, "I've never seen a safe in Dad's office." Richard had said, "It's under the rug behind his desk. It was installed about 8 years ago." I'd felt my heart start pounding. 8 years ago. Right when Thomas and I had started dating. Richard had said, "Does anyone have the combination?" Linda had said, "How would we have the combination if he never told us about the safe?" Richard had said, "Thomas indicated someone might." Patricia had said, "This is ridiculous. If there's a safe, his children should have access to it." Richard had said, legally, if Thomas specified conditions for accessing the safe, those conditions must be met. I'd pulled the birthday card from my wallet. I'd said, "I might have it." The room had gone silent. Derek had said, "What?" I'd shown them the card. The 6 numbers. Richard had looked at the card and said, "That could be a combination. We should go to the house and try it." We'd all driven to Thomas's house in Scarsdale. The house where he'd lived alone for 8 years. The house where I'd spent countless nights. The house his family was about to sell. We'd walked into his office, a room with dark wood paneling and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. Richard had rolled back the rug behind the desk. There was a safe, about 2 feet by 2 feet, with a digital keypad. Richard had stepped back and said, "Ms. Hayes, would you like to try the combination?" I'd knelt down in front of the safe. My hands were shaking. I'd punched in the numbers. 9, 23, 0, 7, 14, 18. The safe had beeped 3 times. Then I'd heard a heavy click. The lock had released. I'd pulled open the door. Inside the safe were several items: a stack of papers, several jewelry boxes, a leather-bound notebook, and a sealed envelope with my name written on it in Thomas's handwriting. I'd pulled everything out and set it on the desk. Patricia had said, "What is all that?" Richard had picked up the envelope addressed to me. He'd said, "Ms. Hayes, this appears to be for you. May I read it aloud, or would you prefer privacy?" I'd said, "Read it aloud." I wanted them all to hear whatever Thomas had left for me. Richard had opened the envelope and pulled out a letter. He'd started reading. The letter said, "Jessica, if you're reading this, you've opened the safe, and my family is probably furious. I'm sorry for putting you in this position, but I couldn't think of another way to make sure you got what I wanted you to have. In this safe, you'll find several things. First, my mother's engagement ring and my grandmother's jewelry collection. These have been in my family for 3 generations. They're worth approximately $500,000. They belong to you. Second, you'll find stock certificates for shares in my investment firm. These shares are worth approximately $8 million. They belong to you. Third, you'll find my personal journals from the past 8 years. You can read them if you want, or destroy them if you don't. They're yours to do with as you wish." The room exploded. Derek had shouted, "That's insane!" Amy had started crying harder. Patricia had said, "He can't do that. Those shares belong to his children." Richard had said, "Actually, Mr. Martin was well within his rights to leave personal property to whomever he chose. The shares were his to distribute." Linda had said, "This is undue influence. She manipulated him." Richard had said, "There's no evidence of that. Mr. Martin was of sound mind when he set this up. He had multiple witnesses confirm his wishes." Richard had kept reading. Thomas had written, "I know my family is upset. They're probably accusing you of manipulation. Let me be clear. You didn't manipulate me. You loved me. Genuinely. Without conditions. You stayed with me through the worst 4 months of my life. You never asked for anything. You never demanded marriage or money or status. You just loved me. That's rare. That's valuable. That's why you get the things that matter to me. My family gets the house and the accounts I set aside for them, but you get my heart, even in death, and the resources that come with it." But there was more. Thomas had written, "I need to explain why I never married you. It wasn't because I didn't love you enough. It was because I didn't trust my family enough. When I divorced Patricia, we fought for 3 years over money. It was vicious. It was ugly. It taught me that people you love can become people you don't recognize when money is involved. I worried that if I married you, if something happened to me, you'd be dragged into that same ugliness. I wanted to protect you from it, so I kept our relationship separate. I kept you out of my legal entanglements. I'm sorry if that hurt you. I'm sorry if you felt like I was holding back. I wasn't. I was holding space for you to be free." Thomas had continued, "I also need you to know why I'm leaving you the shares in jewelry instead of my children. In the notebook, you'll find documentation of things I discovered about my family over the past 8 years. Things that made me realize they didn't value me as a person, only as a source of money. Read it if you want. Or don't. But know that my choices about the estate weren't random. They were based on years of watching people show me who they really were." I'd picked up the leather notebook. I'd started flipping through it. The entries went back 8 years, starting just after Thomas and I had begun dating. The first entry was about Derek. Thomas had written, "Derek called today asking for money to invest in a tech startup. I said no. He hung up on me, didn't call back for 6 weeks. When he did call, he asked for money again, never asked how I was, never asked about my life, Just money. I'd flipped forward. There were dozens of entries about Derek, each one documenting times Derek had only contacted Thomas when he needed something. Money, connections, favors, never just to talk, never just to spend time together. The entries about Amy were different but equally painful. Thomas had written, "Amy called today. Said she wanted to have lunch. I was excited. We met at her favorite restaurant. She spent the entire meal talking about her ex-husband and how much she was struggling financially since the divorce. At the end, she asked if I could help with her mortgage for a few months. I gave her the money. But I realized she hadn't asked a single question about me. Hadn't asked about my health or my work or my life. The lunch wasn't about seeing me. It was about getting money from me. The entries about Patricia were bitter. Thomas had written, "Patricia called today. Asked if I'd attend a charity event with her. Said it would look good for both of us to be seen together. I said no. She called me selfish. Said after 20 years of marriage, I owed her appearances. I reminded her that she'd remarried. She said that didn't matter, that we'd always be connected and I should honor that. I realized she wanted to use my name and reputation for her social standing. She didn't care about me as a person. She never had." The entries about Linda were short but clear. Thomas had written, "Linda called today. Wanted to know if I'd updated my will. Said she was concerned about me being taken advantage of by younger women. I told her my will was none of her business. She said family should know these things. I realized she wasn't concerned about me. She was concerned about her potential inheritance. I'd flipped through more pages. Years of entries. Years of Thomas realizing that his family only contacted him when they wanted something. Money. Help. Favors. Never just because they loved him. Never just because they wanted to spend time with him. He documented it all. Every phone call. Every request. Every disappointment. The last entry was dated 2 months before Thomas died. He'd written, "I'm dying and my family acts like I'm already gone. Derek visits once a week for exactly 30 minutes, always checking his phone. Amy comes on weekends but spends the whole time talking about her own problems. Patricia hasn't visited at all. Linda calls but only to ask about estate planning. The only person who's actually here, who's actually present, who's actually loving me through this, is Jessica. She's here every day. She holds my hand. She listens when I'm scared. She makes me laugh when I'm in pain. She's not family by blood, but she's more family than anyone who shares my DNA. That's why she gets everything that matters. Because she's the only one who's earned it." I'd closed the notebook. I'd looked up at Thomas's family. They were all staring at me with expressions that ranged from shock to fury. Derek had said, "That's not fair. We cared about Dad." I'd said, "Did you? When's the last time you visited him just to visit? Not because he was dying. Not because you felt obligated. Just because you wanted to see him." Derek had said nothing. Amy had said, "We loved him." I'd said maybe, but did you show him that? Did you ever ask him how he was feeling? Did you ever put down your phone and actually be present with him? Amy had started crying again. Patricia had said, "This is ridiculous. You're twisting everything. You manipulated him while he was vulnerable." I'd said, "I was with him every single day for 4 months while he died. Where were you?" Patricia had said, "I have my own life." I'd said, "Exactly. You have your own life. And Thomas wasn't part of it. He knew that. That's why he left you nothing." Linda had said, "You're a gold digger. You spent 8 years positioning yourself for this moment." I'd said, "I didn't even know there was a safe until yesterday. I didn't know what was in it. I loved Thomas. That's all. If you'd loved him like you claim you did, maybe he would have trusted you the way he trusted me." Richard had cleared his throat. He'd said, "Ms. Hayes, these items are now legally yours. The shares will need to be transferred, which will take a few days of paperwork. The jewelry you can take today. The notebook is yours to keep or destroy as you see fit." I'd said, "Thank you." I'd started putting everything back in the safe to carry it out. Derek had said, "We're going to challenge this. We're going to prove you manipulated him." Richard had said, "You're welcome to try." But I should warn you that Mr. Martin had 3 separate psychological evaluations in the months before his death confirming his mental competency. He also had 2 witnesses present when he signed documents giving Ms. Hayes access to the safe. Your challenge will likely fail and will cost you significant legal fees. I'd packed everything into a bag. I'd stood up. I'd looked at Thomas's family one last time. I'd said, "I'm sorry you're hurt. I'm sorry Thomas felt like he had to protect his assets from you. But that's between you and him. I loved your father, your ex-husband, your brother. I loved him when he was healthy and when he was dying. I loved him when it was easy and when it was hard. I never asked him for anything except his time and his honesty. He gave me both. And apparently, he wanted to give me this too. I'm not going to apologize for accepting what he wanted me to have." Patricia had said, "You'll never be accepted by anyone who knew Thomas. Everyone will know you stole from his family." I'd said, "I didn't steal anything. Thomas gave it to me. There's a difference. And honestly, I don't care what people think. I cared what Thomas thought. He thought I deserved this. That's enough for me." Then I'd walked out of the house carrying a bag with $8 million in stock certificates, $500,000 in jewelry, and a notebook full of proof that blood ties don't guarantee love or loyalty. The next few weeks were complicated. Derek and Amy did try to challenge the estate distribution. They hired an attorney who argued that Thomas had been unduly influenced in his final months. Richard had responded with the psychological evaluations, the witness testimonies, and the documentation showing Thomas had set up the safe and the stock transfers 8 months before his diagnosis, when he was perfectly healthy. The challenge fell apart in 3 days. The judge ruled that Thomas had been clear in his intentions and had the right to distribute his property however he chose. The shares were officially transferred to me. I became the partial owner of the investment firm where Thomas had worked for 30 years. I'd expected more resistance from Thomas's family, more legal fights, more attempts to discredit me. But after the judge's ruling, they'd gone quiet. I'd heard through mutual acquaintances that Patricia had told people I'd seduced a dying man for his money, that Derek was telling people his father had been senile at the end, that Amy was playing the victim, saying she'd been cut out of her father's estate by a manipulative girlfriend. I'd let them say whatever they wanted. The truth was documented. Thomas had loved me. He'd trusted me. He'd wanted me to have financial security. Nothing they said could change that. I'd sold most of the jewelry. I'd kept my grandmother's pieces, the ones Thomas had mentioned specifically in his letter. But the rest, I'd sold to a private collector for $470,000. Combined with the stock shares, which generated about $600,000 a year in dividends, I had more money than I'd ever imagined having. I'd quit my job in event planning. I'd started a foundation in Thomas's name that funded pancreatic cancer research. I'd donated $1 million to get it started. I'd made sure Thomas's name was on every piece of literature, every research grant, every public announcement. His family had gotten a house. I'd gotten his legacy. Today, a year later, I'm 35 years old. I live in a small house in Connecticut, about 20 minutes from where Thomas lived. I never wanted the big house, the flashy lifestyle, the status symbols. I just wanted Thomas. Since I can't have him, I have the life he wanted me to have, financial freedom, the ability to do work that matters. The foundation has funded 3 research projects so far. We're close to a breakthrough on early detection methods. If we succeed, we'll save lives. Thomas's death will mean something beyond the pain his family feels and the money I inherited. I think about Thomas every day, about the 8 years we had together, about how he'd loved me enough to plan for my future, even when he knew he wouldn't be part of it, about how he'd documented years of disappointment with his family not to hurt them, but to explain his choices, about how he'd given me a birthday card with 6 numbers that changed my life. I'm grateful for all of it. The money, yes, but more than that. The validation, the proof that I'd mattered to him, that our relationship had been real and valuable and worth protecting. I've seen Derek once since the estate was settled. We'd run into each other at a coffee shop in White Plains. He'd looked at me like he wanted to say something. Then he'd just nodded and walked away. I'd heard from a mutual friend that he'd finally started going to therapy to deal with his father's death and his own issues around money. I'd hoped that was true. I'd hoped he'd learned something from all this. Amy had sent me an email 6 months after Thomas died. She'd apologized for how she'd treated me. She'd said she'd read her father's journals, the ones he'd kept before the final notebook, and had realized he'd been lonely for years. She'd said she regretted not being more present in his life. She'd said she understood now why he'd trusted me. I'd written back and said I hoped she found peace. That was all. Patricia had never reached out. Linda had never reached out. I'd assumed they never would. That was fine. I didn't need their approval or their acceptance. I had Thomas's love, documented in letters and journals, and the financial security he'd left me. That was more than enough. Some people spend their whole lives searching for validation from family members who can't or won't give it. Thomas had spent years documenting that search and its failure. In the end, he'd found validation in me, and I'd found it in him. That mutual recognition, that mutual trust, was worth more than any inheritance. The foundation is hosting a gala next month, a fundraiser for pancreatic cancer research. I'm speaking about Thomas, about his battle with cancer, about the importance of early detection and better treatment options. His name will be everywhere. His story will be told. Not the story his family tells, about a man who abandoned them for a younger woman, but the true story, about a man who loved deeply, who documented carefully, who protected the person who'd been present when it mattered, about a man who knew the difference between blood ties and real loyalty. The sun is setting over Long Island Sound. I'm sitting on my back porch with coffee and Thomas's final notebook. I reread it sometimes, not because I need to justify keeping what he left me, but because it reminds me of what love actually looks like. It looks like someone seeing you clearly and choosing you anyway. It looks like someone planning for your future even when they won't be there. It looks like someone trusting you with their legacy because you earned that trust through years of showing up. That's what Thomas gave me. Not just money, not just jewelry, but the gift of being seen and valued and trusted completely. His family got the house and the accounts and the material things they'd expected. I got everything Thomas actually cared about. His mother's ring, his grandmother's jewelry, his investment firm shares, his documented truth about what family really means. And most importantly, the knowledge that for 8 years, I'd loved someone who'd loved me back just as completely. That's worth more than $8 million. That's worth more than any inheritance. That's the real treasure Thomas left me. The certainty that our love was real, was valuable, was worth protecting, until his very last breath. And now I get to live a life that honors that love, that builds on that foundation, that proves he was right to trust me with everything that mattered. I wouldn't trade that for anything in the world.